Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Bonny Lin. I'm the director of the China Power Project and senior fellow for Asian security at CSIS. We are delighted to have you this morning to examine what's next for India and the Quad. So our panel today is very timely and comes on the heels of the meeting between Quad foreign leaders in Melbourne last week. Last Friday, the White House also released the new U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy that characterized India as a driving force of the Quad and an engine for growth. Today, we have four leading experts on India that will unpack India's views of the Quad and the diplomatic, economic, and military implications of the Quad. I will introduce our panelists in order they will be presenting. Our first panelist is Dr. Mundari Miller, a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Miller is an expert on India, China, and South Asia, and recently published her book, Why Nations Rise, Narratives and Paths to Great Power. Our second panelist is Mr. Rick Rosso, our senior advisor and the Wadhwani chair in U.S.-India policy studies at CSIS. He has spent the last 16 years working in a variety of capacities to strengthen the partnership between the United States and India, currently focused on economic and business engagements. Our third guest is Dr. Harsh Pant, the Director of Studies and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation. Dr. Pant currently researches Asian security issues and recently published New Directions in India's Foreign Policy, Theory and Praxis. Last but not least is Dr. Sana Hashmi, a visiting fellow at the Taiwan-Asia Exchange Foundation and an affiliate scholar with the Research Institute for Indo-Pacific Affairs. Dr. Hashmi is working on her latest book, which explores the relationship between Taiwan and India. So I'm very grateful that the four panelists are joining us from various locations. So we have two of our panelists in DC, but one calling in from India and another from Taiwan. So this is very much a global panel looking at India, not only from the US perspective, but also how India looks at itself. So let me first turn to Manjari to talk about first setting the stage for understanding India. So how does India view the Quad in the context of its overall foreign policy and as a rising power? I asked her to address three related questions. So what are India's major foreign policy goals and aspirations? To what extent does India identify with China as a fellow rising power? And what are the most critical external or regional challenges India faces? And how does India see Quad as a useful vehicle to deal with these challenges? So Manjari, over to you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. First of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be participating in this panel and with such distinguished panelists. I follow Rick's work as I do Harsh's and as well as Sana's. So this is really a fantastic opportunity. Let me just take a very broad view of India's perception of the post-Cold War world, and then talk about its aspirations and challenges. Because in order to understand what India sees as its goal and what India sees as its challenges, you have to first take a step back and understand, how does India view this shift from the Cold War world to the post-Cold War world. So the way India sees it is that there's a bipolar great power rivalry that's emerging today between China and the United States, right? So not a multipolar rivalry, but a bipolar rivalry. And India is worried about this, right? Because India does not want a bipolar great power rivalry because it has intertwined relationships with both, right? So if you look at India-China trade, which is about $82 billion, or at U.S.-India trade, which is about $92 billion, you see this economic enmeshment that exists as far as India is concerned with both of these countries. With the United States, that enmeshment goes even deeper because the United States is India's partner today. It's India's strategic partner, a relationship that 20 years ago was quite thin and has now deepened in multiple ways, in multiple formats, including in terms of security cooperation. But then on the other hand, if you look at how India sees China, despite its enmeshment with China economically, China is also India's biggest external threat, right? So since 1962, which was when India and China had a border war that India lost, and it lost territory, that border dispute is unresolved. And so since 1962, India has had this massive concern about a nuclear armed China on its doorstep. And those concerns have really intensified in the last few years, particularly since 2013. There have been 4 military standoffs between India and China, so at Depsang, at Chumar, at Doklam, and most recently in 2020, there were confrontations at different points in the territory of Ladakh. And actually one of those confrontations resulted in the first fatalities in a long time. At the same time, India is very, very worried about China's relationship with Pakistan, which has been really progressing in leaps and bounds over the last few years, both militarily but also economically through the Belt and Road Initiative. And India is very, very worried about a two-front war that it might have to undertake. The Belt and Road Initiative is another point of tension between India and China, because India sees China both economically and politically expanding its reach through the Belt and Road Initiative into South Asia. And India is very worried about it because it sees South Asia as its sphere of influence, that's its backyard. Its relationship with its neighbors are of primary importance, and it is therefore quite hostile to the Belt and Road Initiative. There are also economic differences despite the trade relationship. So India has a very large trade deficit with China, for example. India is also deeply worried about cybersecurity threats from China. So last night, for example, tax raids were apparently carried out in different offices of Huawei, the Chinese telecom company. And India banned about 54 Chinese apps out of security concerns. So let me just to recap these points about the post-Cold War world. It sees a bipolar great power rivalry emerging. It has intertwined relationships with both US and China, but India sees China absolutely as a huge external threat. But even given these, one difference between the Cold War and today's world is that India is in a much stronger position today than it was during the Cold War, right? So it's considered a rising power. It's a nuclear weapons state. It has one of the largest militaries in the world. It has a huge economic market. And importantly, its emergence as a rising power is backed by the United States, and it's even backed by other countries like Russia. And so then if you take all of these and you look at where India is geographically located, that is really, really important, because the theater of competition, as it sees it between China and the United States, is in the Indo-Pacific. Right. And the Indo-Pacific is deeply important to India, and particularly the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific is India's sphere of influence. So given this geopolitical scenario as India perceives it, what are its goals, right? So I would say the first goal is that India would actually much prefer multipolarity and does not want a bipolar rivalry. Right, because of these enmeshments that it has with both countries, and it certainly does not want to be slotted into any kind of camp, right, where it's forced to openly choose sides in one or the other in a bipolar rivalry. And if you remember that, India is no longer non-aligned, right, which was its driving ideology during the Cold War, and today, but at the same time, it doesn't have alliances either. It still does not prefer alliances, and India has no alliance at this point. So it would much rather have partnerships with all of these countries rather than actually be forced to pick a side and formalize an alliance in any kind of way. So given this preference, what it really wants is China to be balanced, right? So not just by the United States, but by India and even by Russia. It does not want an open confrontation. And the fact that India is more interested in the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific means that it sees the Indian Ocean as its backyard, and it absolutely wants to maintain a sphere of influence in that region, and it wants to keep China and any kind of Chinese encroachment out of that region. So then if you take both this geopolitical scenario and then India's goals with regard to this geopolitical scenario, what you see is the Quad emerging as a vehicle that India sees that it can help it fulfill these goals, given how it views the post-Cold War world, right? So the Quad offers partnership and cooperation. It is not explicitly anti-China, even though that may be the implicit subtext, but it is not an anti-China alliance, and India would not join it if it were. And you will notice that the recent Quad statements encompassed points that were really, really important to India, like counterterrorism. It specifically mentioned terrorist attacks in India. It also left out key other issues that are also important to India. So given India's deep relationship with Russia, there was no joint statement on the Ukraine crisis or on Russian actions in Ukraine. And so the Quad presents for India essentially an opportunity where it draws the United States into the Indo-Pacific, keeps it engaged as a way to balance China, draws in Australia and Japan as well, offers India avenues for cooperation that are economic, that are important security-wise, that are important even in terms of other issues, such as, given the pandemic, vaccine diplomacy and the delivery of vaccines. And it does these and enables India, therefore, it feels, to fulfill some of these goals that I just mentioned. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much. That's a really great intro, as well as a background of how India views its foreign policy with relation to the Quad. So let me now turn to Rick to provide us more of the economic implications of the Quad for India. So I asked Rick to consider 3 different questions too. The first being that many note that Quad is not a security arrangement, but focused on broader geoeconomic issues. Does Rick agree with this assessment? The second question is, from your perspective, what Quad initiatives are the most important to India economically? And what does India view as next steps for the Quad, particularly on the economic side? So Rick, over to you.
Great, well, thanks. Yeah, and let me echo Manjari's comments there. It's fun to be on a panel with friends where we'd probably be having the same conversation over lunch if things were in a little bit different place, and hopefully they will be soon. Terrific questions, Bonnie. I think let me just kind of tee off first by looking at what you brought up on the Quad in terms of its role and positioning vis-a-vis security. It is important to differentiate when we talk about security and defense. I think, it's never simply been that a nation's security is driven entirely by military considerations, but the ability for countries to inflict damage on other countries using non-military tools is only expanding over time, especially as countries become more digitally connected. So when you look at a lot of the work streams the Quad has now, they are very security oriented, even if it's not necessarily going to be a military. Most of the military stuff, which Harsh knows far better than I do, is kind of kept off the books for the Quad, but there's obviously a lot of defense work happening between the members. But the agenda is very heavy on security, so but it's just not military stuff. So the elements that I think that have come through most poignantly from the Quad work streams that evolved so far, number one is on China's ability to dominate data flows. Concerns that Chinese firms are able to soak up vast amounts of private consumer information from countries around the world. Apps like TikTok and others, which are pretty endemic in households across the world. Can that data be firewalled from the Chinese government? Well, clearly it cannot. There is no such thing as a request to be denied from the government if a private firm is asked to hand over information that the government wants. The question is, what exactly is that level of connectivity between private firms and the government? Is it by demand, or are there tools set up to make sure that the information is shared, more seamlessly than we'd like to believe? And so you've seen, in the United States, some government agencies, some corporations have looked to limit. India, as Manjari mentioned, has got this ban on a growing number of Chinese apps, and so you do see like-minded concerns about data domination because, sure enough, if you're able to sort through that information, you can find that some government officials' web browsing history would be embarrassing to be leaked, or maybe some trail they've done on risque activities, philandering, other things, which you can find the online trail for, and that can be used for blackmail and things. So when we talk about data domination, there is a very real security implication for doing that. Emerging technology areas, which has been a real deep area of discussions for the Quad so far. We followed the evolution on the 5G debate pretty closely. And there's a whole lot of other technology areas that kind of follow suit where, if one country, which may have dangerous interests for Quad members, decides to use its ability to switch on, switch off infrastructure, the ability to tap data and that kind of stuff, I know is not quite as easy and straightforward sometimes as portrayed in the media, but the ability to reroute and turn off infrastructure, undersea cables, 5G networks, and things like that are very real. And so, making sure that not one country is able to dominate in that space is going to be pretty important. And then third is, breaking the domination of manufacturing of certain product groups. We've seen with the Made in China 2025 program, China's given us the action plan. They want to dominate global production of a wide range of technologies. And when you look at the list, it's areas like autonomous vehicles, battery storage, things like that. Okay, you do it for commercial. Every kid wants to have a drone flying around, and that's made in China. It's one thing. But a lot of those technologies do have important dual use implications. So if Chinese manufacturers become the best in the world at making autonomous, making battery, making things like this, the potential for military application as they really begin to improve their chops on manufacturing this stuff is fairly apparent. So when you look at the Quad work streams, directly and indirectly, a lot of them have really powerful security implications, even if at the outset there's very little of a military defense component in the Quad discussions. The second thing that you brought up, which is important to discuss, is the Quad initiatives that are important to India economically. The United States is withdrawn from the evolving economic framework, the erstwhile TPP. India withdrawing from RCEP. So, I think the big work streams that are out there right now for economic integration, two of the key Quad members are really sitting out right now. So the question is, what is the Quad doing that's going to be exciting, even if it's not anything as robust as, say, a trade agreement today? At the outset, you have to think about what we've seen from Prime Minister Modi's major economic priorities since he's taken office, going back in 2014. When you think about economic integration, there's two very different work streams. The Modi government, the way that I boil it down, is pro-investment and anti-trade. We've seen the Modi government relax a lot of the existing foreign investment limitations that were there when he took office, when his government took office. Personally courting investors. To see Indian leaders running around the world, being on public stages with foreign company CEOs and actively trying to court their investment. It's always been done a little bit more secretive, and suddenly it's very much out in the open that, attracting foreign investment and bringing those jobs to India, really is a major priority of the government, and that's refreshing to see. And a lot of India's domestic reforms that you've seen, like their, really massive jumps up the World Bank's ease of doing business indicators, also kind of indicate that they want to show the country's open for business for investment. But on the trade side, I think, as we pointed out before, India's got a massive trade deficit with the world. Here in the United States, we know the incredible contentious issues we're facing right now on trade integration. And our trade deficit to GDP is just a couple percentage points. In India this year, it's probably going to be about 8%. That's the trade deficit to GDP. So the challenges India faces in trying to trigger a greater manufacturing industry are immense. And so you've seen the Modi government also put in place a lot of new obstacles. I think there's been concerns and complaints from India from time immemorial about liberalization and such, but for the most part, it's about the pace. Since the reforms began in '91, it's mostly been, intermittent steps to open the economy. But under the Modi government, you've actually seen steps to move the other way. Every budget has got usually dozens of sectors that have doubling sometimes of customs duties. You see big expansions in local content requirements. So if you want to win contracts, especially from government agencies, just a couple of days ago, India formally banned the import of drones, with the exception of those that are used for military and security, and then some level of technical research. And so big program to try to improve domestic production of drones. So when you think about Quad economic functions, you have to understand that I think the Modi government believes that these dual tracks of pro-investment and anti-trade is reactive to what he thinks the political that voters want to see in India. So there's going to be a bit of a hard line, I think, a bright line in terms of what India can do for economic integration under the Quad. So I think some of the areas so far that India would look at as potential opportunities is, if ultimately Quad and other functions, begin trying to push companies to consider, at least not placing all their investments for global production in China. India wants to grab some portion of that investment that could be rerouted as manufacturers look to diversify supply chains. Regionally, India would like to see the Quad's work on infrastructure really begin to take off. When India thinks about the challenges they face in their own neighborhood, today it's not so much a military threat that China has, at least in the maritime domain. It's more of China's aggressive attempts to develop strategic infrastructure in the region. Obviously, for 99-year control of Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, the development of a port in Gwadar in Pakistan, the attempt to grab land, which of course they have at least for vacation complexes in Maldives, but credible evidence that they were trying to get territory for naval operations from Maldives. I mean, you look at this, Myanmar, the map is getting dotted, as India has been pointing out for years now, with Chinese attempts to grab strategic infrastructure in the region. So Quad work on infrastructure is going to be pretty important for India's interests. Pandemic cooperation, India's got a commercial interest there too. As we talk about jointly producing vaccines for the world, India obviously is the workshop for the world for making vaccines. So there are some areas that I think when you consider like the main priorities for Modi economic policies on trade and investment, there are a couple of pathways where I think the Quad work streams, both meet some kind of international good while also not crossing red lines. I think that the Modi government has, based on the what he sees as the political indicators for his voting base. Lastly, you asked about what India wants from the Quad long term, and thinking India's mindset about next steps. And again, I know Harsh will have some great thoughts on this as well. But I think that one thing that I think every American's got to keep in mind, India looks at the Indian Ocean as the contested area that they're most concerned about. And I remember so vividly when former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, kind of laid out the Indo-Pacific strategy for the Trump administration, and really the word Indo in Indo-Pacific getting weighed in. So much questioned at the time what Indo meant. Was it India, or was it Indian Ocean? And it sounds like one of these hair-splitting semantic debates. But for India, it meant everything. Was it trying to drag India into the Pacific theater, where most American security officials think all the action is? Or was it a recognition in the United States that the Indian Ocean today is contested waters, and if we don't start engaging more deeply now, then we're going to lose it, and India is going to suffer, some real challenges in the future. And I think over time, and thanks to India's nudging, you've seen over the last number of years that at least our bilateral work has become a lot more cognizant, I think, between the U.S. and India on the Indian Ocean. We've given India observer access to our regional security commands in the area. India has reciprocated by granting an American official access to their Indian Ocean Information Fusion Center in Gurgaon. You saw a massive tri-service exercise in the region there. So I think for the Quad, India's going to want to see the Indian Ocean very central to a lot of the specific activities looking at. And the second thing I'd say is, not just simply looking at cooperation in the Indian Ocean, but I think India would expect that the Quad members, when we talk about Indian Ocean strategy together, would understand that we have to cede a high degree of leadership to India. If all four countries approach other countries in the Indian Ocean with their own plans, and after the fact say, hey, India, we're doing this thing in Sri Lanka, we want to come on board, it's not going to work as well. Especially since, as we've seen countries like Sri Lanka and Myanmar and others that have got real political challenges, Bangladesh, our countries all approach that differently. And we have real opportunity for conflict unless we iron out those things ahead of time. So it's not just Indian Ocean strategy and where we can combine efforts, but making sure that we've got to be able to cede India leadership in that to some degree. Otherwise, there will be natural antibodies created. The last thing is looking at, I think when we talk about defense technology, even if the Quad is not focused on defense, the Quad doesn't live in a disconnected silo where everything that's happening there is completely unattached. As I mentioned before, I think doubling down too in a lot of these dual use technologies China's looking to dominate. This is an area that I think India is going to have a real interest in. Of course, they want to grab a piece of the pie. If all relevant deals that fall to this as we look to spread out the manufacturing base and diversify production, if all that goes to the United States or other places, that may not work out too well. But if India can grab a piece of that as they look to concretize, because right now, again, you got a lot of work streams in the Quad that have a private sector orientation, but there's no private sector input for that really, and making sure that opportunities are kind of apportioned in some thoughtful way, so that as we look to push manufacturers to diversify, no country is left out from that. Is going to be critical. Otherwise, you're going to find that if every new opportunity that's triggered on sourcing a new strategic mineral or a new pharmaceutical ingredient, if an American company or an Australian company is dominating all those and Indian firms aren't achieving any new progress, that's going to reduce momentum there. So that's kind of the last consideration, I think, as we look at this. But I'll wrap it up there. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you, Rick. Some really great points there. I was particularly struck by your differentiation between the Quad dealing with security issues versus military issues. I think I haven't heard too many people really highlight the difference between security and military, and I think that's a great point. I also really liked your point, your emphasis on the need to support Indian leadership if we were to be serious about working with India at the Quad. And you left a number of issues for Harsh to address when looking at the strategic and military implications of the Quad. I also posed 3 questions for Harsh, so welcome your responses to these 3 questions or any of the other questions that Rick already posed for you in his discussion. So the 3 questions I asked Harsh to consider was, as India thinks about the Quad, how does India think about expanded military security ties with other Quad countries on either a bilateral or trilateral basis? Does India welcome the Quad playing a larger role on security and military issues, I would add, in the region? And if so, in what areas? And how does India view its relationship with Russia, and how does that impact its considerations of the Quad? So Harsh, thank you again for joining us, particularly calling in from India. Over to you.
Thanks, Manjari and Rick, for making such great points. I think half of my work is done. I'll just take off from where both of them perhaps left. In a sense, my own understanding is that if we were having this conversation, say 5 years back, it would be a very different kind of conversation, even about Quad, for example. Where is Quad headed? There have been so many discussions around the fact that Quad is not viable, that Quad is not effective, that Quad somehow will never gain traction. Of course, the Chinese have made these points in a different context, but others, observers have been making this point. And then let us recall that the first time Quad emerged was, almost a decade and a half back, 2007, and since when, and then it disappeared. So I think the resurrection of Quad in 2017, perhaps, and India's wholehearted embrace of Quad, if you see, the kind of comments that Indian leadership today makes about Quad, is in some ways an acknowledgement that the realities, the strategic realities around India in the Indo-Pacific have changed to an extent where without a platform like Quad, it won't be possible to manage some of these challenges as far as India on its own is concerned. And I think that acknowledgement itself tells you a story about the arc of Indian foreign policy, traversing from one end of the spectrum to another. And much as India is averse to alliances or the fact that you don't want to end up into security relationships, the reality is has been that somehow the challenges have been growing, and somehow India had to respond to those challenges. And therefore, for India today, Quad is a strategic reality, and I think, and one can't get away from this fact. That it is very much strategic in nature. It is here to stay, and I think Minister Jaishankar's comments just a few days back, when he said, "Look, if you keep on criticizing Quad, it does not mean that it is of any less value." He was of course talking about the Chinese reaction to it, but I think it was also an acknowledgement that this is a positive agenda here that India, along with the other 3 Quad members, are mapping out for themselves and for the region. So India is invested in it, and I think India has gone all out in some ways in making sure that its voice not only is enmeshed with the voice of the other 3 partners, but also those of you who would have watched this most recent meeting would have seen, and I think Manjari pointed it out, that not only Ukraine was missing from the joint statement, you also had Minister Jaishankar making a pointed reference to Myanmar and how his views on Myanmar are different from the other 3 countries. So I think the idea here has always been to be a bit creative in terms of interpreting the structural realities and India's response to it. And I would say that this is, the arrangement of Quad works well for India, because the other 3 countries are traditional alliance partners. India is not an alliance partner of the US, and so it allows India that flexibility, which I think it is looking in its partnerships, in its security partnerships in particular. And I think the point that you mentioned in terms of the security relationships with each of the three countries, whether it is Japan, whether it is Australia, and whether it is the US, if you look at the security aspect of their relationship, it has grown by leaps and bounds. Of course, India is doing military exercises. India has signed all the foundation agreements. I think the defense relationship has been the driver in the last few years of Indo-US relationship. Rick has rightly pointed out, economic ties have always been wobbly. But it was the defense that was driving the relationship, and that is something that I think will continue to grow, irrespective of what happens at the Quad level. So I think at perhaps we can understand this with a from the perspective of New Delhi, this is a two-pronged approach, perhaps. Bilaterally, trilaterally, I think India is much more comfortable dealing with security issues, but at the Quad level, perhaps security defined in more comprehensive terms, I think something that Rick defined, Rick was talking about, that look, if you're looking at post-COVID world order and the security issues and the political discourse in the countries, including in the US, on what constitutes national security, I think, we are looking at a completely different narrative. Vaccine diplomacy is part of your, what's the primary security threat to the world today, to the region today? Health. So you have COVID, vaccines, and then you have infrastructure, and how do you make sure that you are providing alternatives to the region in infrastructure? Then you have supply chains and critical technologies. Again, very, very important from a strategic security point of view as well. But not defined in terms of defense per se. So I think one way of looking at it would be that bilaterally, trilaterally, we would continue to see India's relationships with Australia, Japan, and the US grow, whereas Quad will take on those issues, or is more likely to take on issues where, which are sort of security related, but not defense oriented. So I think, and I think there are two reasons for that. One reason is that Indo-Pacific as a strategic geography is still, a virgin territory in terms of, institutional architecture, in terms of the availability of mechanisms to address some of these challenges, whether they are climate change, whether they are health, whether they are infrastructure, whether they are supply chain. So in some ways, something, something has to be done about it. And I think Quad allows. Perhaps the first step towards that is what Quad members can do in that regard. The other is that if you make it, and I think Manjari has touched upon it, if you make it explicitly about China, then not only will, I think more than India, it's the other countries that will be uncomfortable. How will you convince other countries in the Indo-Pacific to join Quad or to work with Quad if the headline is that this is a platform which is anti-China? And I don't think most of the countries in the region would be willing to do that. So I think instead of doing that, perhaps the space is available for like-minded countries like the four partners of the Quad to shape this platform in a direction which perhaps allows for the possibility of providing solutions to regional problems, and which can be from health, climate to infrastructure and supply chains. And I think that is how one would like to assess where India's attempts are focused on and what India would like to do. I think bilaterally, trilaterally, we will see much greater traction on defense, but on the Quad, I think we would continue to see this developing through the larger comprehensive security framework. Now, the question, of course, remains that I think the point that you touched upon is the Russia question, and how do you what are the sort of issues around which one can look at India's engagement with Quad versus India's engagement with Russia. I think Manjari talked about this non-alignment, move away from non-alignment, and we have seen in recent years Indian leadership talking about issue-based alignments. That there is a certain comfort level in terms of saying that, look, we are not non-aligned anymore, but we are willing to align ourselves on issues which which are common to us with like-minded partners. So I think that move is interesting, and for a while I think there has been this flexibility that you could say that India has partnerships with Quad countries. India also has partnerships with Russia and China, the RIC platform. Very interestingly, RIC was talked about in the joint statement when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met at the Beijing Olympics. So clearly, I think India has tried to navigate this position for a while. It is becoming difficult. There is no doubt. I think if you look at the trend lines, it is very clear that if anti-Western, prism is the one through which Russian foreign policy is going to, manifest itself, then that would be very difficult for India to manage, because India, especially, I think this government in particular, has been one of the most openly, explicitly pro-Western governments in last several decades. So I don't think there is any confusion about where perhaps Indian priorities lie. But given Russia's role in India's foreign policy, both on defense as well as on regional security matters, as well as I think it allows certain space to both India and Russia vis-a-vis China. I think it allows Russia that space vis-a-vis China to say that, look, India is a partner, and it allows India that space vis-a-vis, I think, West, to say that we have Russia as a partner. So I think that space is an important one, that diplomatic space is an important one for both countries. And I don't think either of the two are willing to let that go. We saw that, I think, Mr. Putin's first major visit to a country in November last year was to India. He made that in-person visit. So I think there is an investment at the top level that continues to happen in the relationship. But if you look deep down in the relationship, it is a problematic relationship. There are divergences. There is hardly any economic content to the relationship. The defense relationship is also fracturing in some ways, because India is diversifying. And so clearly the trend lines are very clear that there is going to be a long-term divergence eventually between India and Russia, but we are not there yet. So I think Russia remains a very important node for Indian foreign policy, and that question will continue to hang over India's conversations with other partners. That's not going to go away anytime soon. And perhaps how India navigates this in the short to medium term will be an important factor also in its relationship with the US, because one of the things that India has been telling its Western partners is that it is perhaps the Russia-China axis, which is developing by leaps and bounds, has something to do with the lack of imagination on the part of the West to be able to break this relationship. Now, how far one can debate about that, but I think there is a sense in India that the West has to look at it strategically as well as to where what kind of a relationship Russia and China shared at one particular point in time, and where that relationship is today. And so I don't think the idea is to isolate Russia at all from India's perspective. I think the idea would be to continue to use its historical partnership with Russia to make certain points, to find areas of convergence, and to continue to invest in the relationship, despite the fact that it may be very, very difficult. And I would just end by saying that, look, if Quad is largely a strategic platform for India, it is important from India's perspective, and I think both Manjari and Rick touched upon it, that Indian Ocean is important, and India would like more and more like-minded countries to be invested there. And I think that's again a very significant shift from the past, where India was cagey about the involvement of Western countries, or any other country for that matter, in the Indian Ocean. Today, India is more comfortable, perhaps because of the China factor, that there are like-minded countries out there that need to be invested in the Indo-Pacific. So I think any kind of crisis like Ukraine crisis, or what happens with Russia, the disagreements with Russia, there is a discomfort in India that takes the attention away from the Indo-Pacific to the European theater, and that's not something that is in India's interest. And therefore, the partnerships, the more partnerships India has in the region with regional players as well as extra-regional players, the better it is in terms of India's own framing of managing the rise of China, which is creating so many complications for India at so many levels. So I'll step there.
Thank you, Harsh. Much food for thought. And I'm sure we will return to many of the topics you touched on, particularly Russia and Ukraine, which are very much dominating the news now. But before we do that, let me turn to our last speaker, our panelist, Asana, who will actually focus do a bit of a pivot to look at not only India's relationship with the Quad, but also what this means in terms of other regional partners, and particularly with respect to Taiwan, a potential flashpoint between the United States, China, but also a flashpoint that could bring in other regional countries. So the couple of questions I asked Hannah to consider is, what is the state of India-Taiwan relations? Does India expect, given its close relations with Quad countries and the strong positions that the US, Japan, Australia have taken on Taiwan, that India will be asked to do more on Taiwan? And how does India think generally about Taiwan contingencies and conflicts? So Sana, over to you, and thank you again for joining us from Taipei.
Thank you so much. And all these questions are very important because I feel that it's rare that we discuss Taiwan when we discuss quadrilateral security dialogue. And because there's a belief that there are far more important topics to discuss than Taiwan. So apart from the question that you have asked me, I'm also going to talk about why it is important for countries, like-minded countries, specifically India, to talk about Taiwan within the quadrilateral framework. So when we talk about the Quad and Taiwan, there's no doubt that Taiwan is not mentioned in this statement, in the joint statement, primarily because of India's hesitance. And India is the only Quad country that has not spoken openly about Taiwan. And while the other three countries at different levels have shown support towards Taiwan, have spoken about Taiwan in some way, India has not yet talked about it. So despite that, there is definitely a policy shift towards Taiwan from India's side, I would say. The civil society support and even the social media exchanges between Indian and Taiwanese ministries last year, it tells us about how India's Taiwan policy is undergoing a shift. And from Taiwan side, with the initiation of the new southbound policy and the Tsai Ing-wen coming to power, India has officially become a part of Taiwan's foreign policy outreach in the region. But for a very long time, there was lack of ambition and even mutual neglect in the relationship. And before the initiation of the NSP, Taiwan's external engagement was largely confined to managing cross-strait tensions and to further strengthen its relationship with the West. I see that is changing now, and especially when I came to Taiwan in 2020, from then to now, I see tangible changes in both Taiwan and India's policies. I think that there is more awareness of each other's interests and concerns now. We are seeing that there are more convergences between India and Taiwan. There is this unprecedented enthusiasm about Taiwan and India. And I think this is primarily because how Taiwan responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, how it has contributed to a positive perception about Taiwan among Indians. And this was, of course, impacted by how Indians have started seeing China, how Indians' perception is changing towards China in view of the standoff, and also how China's assertive behavior is rising towards India, as well as Taiwan. So I think this is a binding factor when we talk about how Indians and Taiwanese are looking at each other. So there is definitely this visible shift in the domestic discourse in India, which is increasingly tilting towards Taiwan's favor now. So there were several positive developments in the past 2 years, but I still believe that despite those several positive developments, India is still somewhat cautious while openly engaging Taiwan in areas other than economics, science and technology, education. And this cautious behavior also restricts India to include Taiwan within the quadrilateral discussion. There's no doubt that there is greater alignment among the Quad countries, the issuing of one joint statement, frequent meetings, and even Minister Jaishankar's upfront statements about China. It all shows us that the Quad is increasingly moving towards further institutionalization. And in the words of Minister Jaishankar, the Quad is here to stay. But I guess that Taiwan is one issue where India will take its own time to decide when and how it wants to start openly talking about it within the quadrilateral framework and elsewhere. And I also believe that its engagement with Taiwan should not be really viewed through the lens of the cross-strait relationship. And this is a sensitive issue for both Taiwan as well as India. But having said that, I also believe that there are other reasons why India should really shed its hesitance and talk about Taiwan alongside other Quad countries. The first reason I would say that the very idea of the Quad and the Indo-Pacific is that whoever shares similar values should be welcomed within the Indo-Pacific framework. And as the Indo-Pacific construct is evolving, the countries that share the similar values should be welcome. And the need for major stakeholders to have a concerted policy towards Taiwan should become all the more relevant and important for like-minded countries. And for India, I believe facilitating Taiwan's participation in the Indo-Pacific and perhaps later in Quad will only boost India's resolve for ensuring a rules-based order. And Taiwan, that's a robust democracy and a like-minded country, will contribute further stability to the region. And in order to ensure stability, I strongly believe that India should facilitate Taiwan's participation. Then when India has aspirations to play a decisive role, a bigger role in the region, it has to take some bold decisions, bold steps that reinforces its image of a country whose foreign policy is not dictated and directed by China. So for the Indo-Pacific to be truly open, transparent, and inclusive, it is the responsibility of the pioneer countries, such as the US and India, to ensure that a like-minded country like Taiwan should not be excluded. Second, I believe that there needs to be more alignment among the Quad countries, and it should not just be on China, but it should also be on Taiwan. Then other like-minded countries have been actively engaging Taiwan and finding alternatives to strengthen cooperation without impacting their respective ties with China. And in the process, countries have also benefited from engagement with Taiwan. So I believe that when we talk about India's engagement with Taiwan, there is immense potential and synergy in India's Act East policy and Taiwan's new southbound policy. And as I've also already mentioned, that Taiwan and India share common values, and they also are facing similar challenges, and specifically how both the countries are facing aggression from China's side. So I believe that this also should motivate India to engage Taiwan meaningfully. And this should not be seen as a move to further strengthen India's resolve to fight China. But I believe, on the contrary, it should be seen as a move to strengthen its own policy moves in the region, such as Act East policy and its own Indo-Pacific vision. I think it would also further strengthen India's regional aspirations and will make the Quad stronger and robust. Then when we talk about other countries' approaches towards Taiwan, towards quadrilateral dialogue, US is an important example here. US is an important partner for India and as well as for Taiwan. And then the Biden administration is continuing its focus on Taiwan. And Taiwan, I believe, should be a convergent interest for both countries, and working towards amplifying Taiwan's voice should be a natural step for both India and the US. And I believe that this could be acted as a stabilizer in the region, voicing support and talking about Taiwan openly in the Indo-Pacific region. Then apart from the US, Japan has also proven to be a crucial partner for both Taiwan and India. We are witnessing DPP and LDP talks now, and such talks are actually playing an important role in bridging the gap that is created by the lack of diplomatic ties. So these moves are not official in nature, but political enough to strengthen ties between the two countries. And then Japan has also made it clear that the security of Taiwan is directly linked to the security of Japan. So any attempt to invade Taiwan will have repercussions, not just for the countries such as Japan and the US, but India will also have to face consequences and repercussions. So, but when I say that, I really don't mean to say that India has to intervene in the potential Taiwan contingencies, and it also won't. It's not India's policy to interfere in either Taiwan or China's internal affairs, and any change in such a policy is unlikely for now. And this is also because once India speaks about Taiwan openly or does something like that, that policy change cannot be reversed. So India has to really tread lightly. And I think this is one of the reasons why India is taking its own time vis-a-vis Taiwan. But I believe that the focus of like-minded countries, especially the Quad countries, should be on deterring China from doing so. And this could only be done when the countries such as US and India and Japan, they all openly talk about Taiwan within the Quad framework. And I believe that this will be very important in the context of maintaining peace and stability in the region. But then I would also like to talk about how, being in Taiwan, I think it's very important to also see how Taiwan perceives the quadrilateral security dialogue. In my interactions with the policy makers and scholars, I have realized that Quad is viewed positively in Taiwan, and Taiwan would want the Quad to acquire latent security component. There's no doubt about that. And the reason is that by extension, if Quad becomes a security grouping, that it would also provide Taiwan with a security umbrella, as Quad as a security grouping will deter China in a way. And this support also comes from the idea that no single country alone can deal with China. And a coordinated joint response is needed for that. And like Quad countries, Taiwan too is functioning on this and working towards strengthening partnerships in the region. And Taiwan's response is also aided by the fact that the Quad has got bipartisan support within the member state countries. And if we don't talk about India and Australia here, Taiwan's relation with the US and Japan, it has been robust, but also from Australia's perspective, in the recent years, we are seeing there's this new kind of warmth from Australia's side towards Taiwan. But within the Quad framework, I believe that Taiwan should be included in the discourse, and slow and steady steps could be taken here. One example could be that the US and Japan are already participating in Taiwan-led global cooperation training framework. So India should also participate through its representative office here and cooperate on issues of common interest such as climate change, health, etc. I believe that these countries, even within the framework of GCTF, they don't really have to talk about security issues, but they could really start with issues such as health, climate change, the issues that I have just talked about. So to conclude, I would say the policies and approaches of India and Taiwan align in the present circumstances, how they're facing similar challenges, and Indian leadership should sense the situation and adopt a long-term, consistent and active policy towards Taiwan. And recent developments have actually provided a window of opportunity for both India and Taiwan to revisit their policies towards each other. So perhaps within the quadrilateral framework, I think to start with, the statement of Taiwan could be issued. China already considers and calls the Quad an anti-China grouping, then including Taiwan won't really change much. I know it's a bold step, but there is nothing that could change China's perception about the quadrilateral dialogue. So the statement shouldn't be about their respective relationship with Taiwan, but I think would be the generic one, like the ones have been used earlier, emphasizing importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So because this is one issue which impacts all like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific, I think this could be a welcome step. And if India is too cautious to talk about Taiwan at the bilateral level or to engage Taiwan in areas other than economic and health, etc., then I think Quad is a good platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana. I like the idea of you introducing bold statements here and bold ideas, because this is it's a great forum for discussion, but also to get the ideas out and see how other people respond. So in the interest of time, we have about 8 minutes or so for Q&A, and I did want to follow up on one issue that was touched by multiple folks first. So that is the issue of Ukraine. I think, Manjari, you touched on this first, and then Harsh touched on it again. So what is India's position on Ukraine, and what could we see India do if we do see a conflict in Ukraine? So Manjari, over to you first, and then potentially Harsh, and then we'll go to a number of other questions that have been queuing up.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. So, when Harsh was talking, Harsh, I remember this piece. I think it was in Asian Security. You wrote it about 15 years ago. And I still remember that because one of the lines in it, which I've cited, is how Russia was, there was this historical relationship between India and Russia, and how it was one of the most important partnerships that India had. So it was very interesting to me when you talked about how the long-term trend is about diversifying away from Russia, because that's been a shift over the last 15 years. But the reason I would bring it up is because when it comes to Ukraine right now, given the situation in terms of India's relationship with the United States and with Russia, which is a very deep relationship, which has gone back many, many decades, pretty much India has no good options, right? And that's the bottom line. There are no good options for India in Ukraine. What India would like to happen in Ukraine is for the crisis to quietly go away without it have been in any position to have to do anything at all. And that would be the best option. That's not happening so far. But essentially, it's a really fraught situation. And so any action that India does take vis-a-vis Ukraine has massive risks for India, right? So it could criticize Moscow. And if it does, it's going to alienate a really important historical friend. Even today, despite India's attempts to diversify, almost 70% of India's military hardware is Russian. And even worse, India is really worried that criticizing Moscow means that Russia is going to get even closer to China, which of course is a massive threat for India. If India backs Moscow, it's going to tank its relationship with the United States, which is a newer partner, but a very, very valuable strategic partner. And when it says nothing, then it risks alienating both, because anytime it says nothing, the non-statements are being seized upon as evidence of support. So for example, when India abstained from the UN Security Council resolution to discuss Ukraine, the Russian government took that as an expression of support and thanked not just India from abstaining, but it also thanked China, which is, of course, then puts India in a very untenable position. So the bottom line is India does not have good options in Ukraine. I think the problem, as I see it going forward, is that I don't know how long India can maintain this balancing act, right? Because even if you look at the worst case outcome and there's war in Ukraine, that also is really inimical to India's interests, not just economically, if you think about, the energy and gas and oil prices, but even geopolitically, because then, of course, what's going to happen is it's going to have the effect of, India being put in a position where it just has to choose, and it does not want to choose. The whole point to India's strategy is actually maintaining these multipolar relationships and maintaining this balancing act. So essentially, let me just put it this way, that Ukraine has come at a really bad time for India. India wishes the crisis would dissipate. It's not dissipating so far, despite recent developments. And so it just does not have any good options. And the question is, how long can it continue to essentially, have these non-statements and continue balancing, when in the long run, if you do have war in Ukraine, that's not going to benefit India either.
Thank you. Harsh, anything you want to add?
No, Manjari is far more articulate than I can ever be. But I'll just add one thing that, if you have, if you think from India's perspective, the long-term challenge, it's very clear, it's China. But ironically, India needs both Russia and America to manage China. So it's a very interesting position to be in, very difficult for policymakers, but I think for analysts like us, we can just enjoy, in a sense, the challenge that it poses in terms of assessing, because as Manjari was saying, India is reliant on Russia for its defense requirements. So if you are standing on the border facing Chinese military might, you really don't want to be in a position where you are antagonizing the Russians. And then, of course, the long-term trajectory, where that at the end of the day, partnership with America is going to be the central feature of your posture in the Indo-Pacific to manage China. So I think clearly both of these countries are needed, one in the short term, perhaps, and maybe one in the medium to long term, but that's the reality. And I think a crisis like Ukraine just exposes India to these multiple pressure points, which I don't think India would want to be, and no country would like to be in that position. But I think increasingly it's becoming untenable. But certainly I don't think there is India would like to make a choice at this juncture if it can afford, so long as it can afford to do that.
Let me just mention one thing too, if I can, Bonnie. One thing that hasn't come up that I remember in the conversation so far, something very specific. India in the next couple of months will light up for the first time its new S-400 missile defense system kits. And that would probably be the point, because it's a little bit undefined in US sanctions legislation, but that would probably be the point where the United States has to make a determination, which sanctions are the default. And there's a very narrow pathway for potentially, not implementing sanctions, for waiving the sanctions, which those of us who study it closely, it's a tough call on whether you can say credibly that it meets all the conditions for a waiver. But gosh, if Congress is doubling down on sanctions because of the invasion, then suddenly, the appetite maybe to try to press through for the first time a waiver gets a little harder. So all this time that I think a lot of groups that should have been more active in widening the waiver or making sure there was a pathway, but it's not going to be a deal. Russia's making it a deal. This is not a bipolar thing between the United States and India. Russia's actions play heavily here. So one very concrete element too, if anything has the chance to split the Quad apart, sanctions against India in the very near horizon could be the thing. So one more to keep your eye on.
Let me follow up on that, Rick. So with respect to what could happen next, how do you see India viewing the US Indo-Pacific strategy? And do you think it goes far enough with respect to India? And then after you answer that, one final question for Sana is, there's been some questions from the audience with respect to what is Taiwan's position on India? Does Taiwan align with India with respect to the China-India border question? So Rick, to you first, and then we'll close with the final question with Sana.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fresh, having a lot of opportunities, I think, to gauge folks in India. So Harsh would have some thoughts on this too. But broadly, you got a carve-out section which has all the right language, support India's continued rise and regional leadership. But I mentioned before, the fact that as we engage the Indian Ocean more deeply, we need to make sure that it's in line with India's interests is crucial. So I think we use the right language there. The other thing you brought up beforehand to touch on, is the Indo-Pacific economic framework, and I saw at least one, maybe multiple questions that came through on that too. In a briefing that I had with White House staff last week as they were releasing, they did offer a little bit more detail. The probably most important is, that the framework is expected to come out as kind of piecemeal, different elements. Countries can buy into different pieces rather than a one fell swoop and you have to do everything. And in that sense, I think, the chance even for the economic framework to find some spaces, again, if it aligns with, breaking China domination of manufacturing of certain components or data dominate, that kind of stuff, I think India, they're moving on unilaterally. And so doing it collectively where other countries kind of agree, might make some sense. So, the White House also confirmed that, this is not going to be a collection of developed countries where we already have established trade relationships. They want to use this to push for developing countries. So they didn't, nobody said India by name so far, but with the intent on getting those countries that are kind of at the pivot point to buy in for whatever this framework is, which is still very undefined. You see a lot of press out there. India's so hard to work with on trade. They're probably not going to be part of it. My own sense is they'll give it a go. And the fact that it's piecemeal, there's a pretty good chance that some elements will be appealing. So I'm hopeful. So that's kind of my quick take. Thanks.
Harsh, do you want to weigh in on this briefly?
No, I think the strategy looks great, and I think the fact that India is seen as the central pivot for the quadrilateral, I think that is also a good sign, and that is where I think this this issue Rick raised about S-400, and if you go back to say the last few years, there have been multiple occasions where issues like S-400 or even the Chabahar question with Iran, for example, have come. And I think what is interesting about Indo-US relationship today is I think the maturity with which the two nations have handled this relationship so far, avoiding some of these issues, and keeping the eye on the ball, which is the Indo-Pacific, and which is the larger strategic alignment in the region. So I think if that strategic perspective is kept, hopefully, perhaps some of these issues can be navigated much more easily, and which we have seen. There is some evidence to that effect. But again, with what is happening in Ukraine, everything is up in the air in some ways.
Thank you. The final question for Sana, and I think it's a valid question. To what extent is Taiwan actually supporting Indian positions, particularly vis-a-vis China?
I agree, it's a very good question, and it's very important to see how we are looking towards each other, how Taiwan is looking at India and how India is looking at Taiwan. I believe India is perceived as a very friendly country in Taiwan. And while in the past 2 years, I would say that from India's side, this warmth is a recent development. But from Taiwan's side, the attempt to engage India has been in place at least since 2016, and I talked about it during my presentation with the initiation of the new southbound policy. But I think I might be exaggerating a little bit, but I would go ahead and say it, that I think new southbound policy is a new avatar of the previous Go South policy, which was there in the Southeast Asian region. So I think Taiwan is kind of attempting to have the same model with India, what it did with the Southeast Asian region, specifically in terms of economic relationship. Now, coming to the border dispute, I haven't really come across any statement supporting India on the boundary dispute, but I would say that there is support when it comes to China's rising aggression towards India, because in the past 2 years, China is also there in the South China Sea. There's this active dispute in the South China Sea, but only India and Taiwan were the two countries that had to face, and they're still facing China's aggression. So I think there's this common point, and this point is actually binding India and Taiwan together. So I have seen statements from the leaders, from officials, then they talk about how India and Taiwan are facing similar challenges. And this is one of the reasons why like-minded countries should work together to address common challenges. But also within the quadrilateral framework, as I also mentioned, that Taiwan has robust ties with Japan and the US and with Australia as well. We are seeing that there is new kind of warmth. So they're also placing India within that context. And if they could also extend similar kind of relationship with India, this is what Taiwan is seeking when it comes to India-Taiwan relations.
Thank you very much, Sana. And I'm cognizant that we are 5 minutes over. We do tend to close on time, but let me wrap up with thanking all 4 of our panelists. We could not have asked for a better set of experts on this, and particularly for the panelists who are joining us, not only from DC, but also from New Delhi and Taiwan. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for staying with us for 1 hour and 5 minutes. Have a wonderful day.